Hannah, no, I think you've absolutely said everything. And yeah, I'll echo your comments. A very warm welcome to everybody. Really excited to be here to discuss this important and rather large topic. Um, so yeah, my name is Joe Gizeski and I work for the Bristol Poverty Institute as a development associate. And as Hannah said, today's event is hosted by the BPI. And just to give a bit more background around that, we wanted today's event to be quite obviously informative and to discuss this big topic, but we also wanted it to be participatory and kind of informal. So that's why we decided to go with the breakout rooms option, and hopefully that will allow everyone to get a good discussion in a sort of smaller group. So yeah, we hope that that's what transpires and that everybody feels free to share their ideas, no matter how big, no matter how small. So with that, I will share my screen and just do a little intro to the BPI before I go into my presentation. How's that, everybody? Hopefully you can see that. Yep, getting some thumbs up, so that's good. So just to kick off with an introduction to the BPI. So the BPI was established in 2017, and everything we do is geared towards SDG 1, which is to end poverty in all its forms everywhere. So what we want to do is grow and develop and support the poverty and poverty relevant research community at the University of Bristol and beyond. We want to facilitate interdisciplinary approaches and explore the interface of different social, political and environmental dimensions of poverty mainly. And ultimately, the end goal is to positively affect policy and practice. So that's what we do at the BPI. We have a little team that's just got a little bit smaller recently. So it's just 3 of us at the moment. Tracy's with us today, but unfortunately, David Gordon couldn't make it today. So with that, I will begin the first of today's presentations. So Hannah, if you could start my 15 minutes now so I can have the full 15 minutes, that'd be great. So yeah, my presentation today is entitled Capitalism, Neoliberalism and Disaster Capitalism. And the original research title was The Problem of Disaster Capitalism for Humanitarian Action, a COVID-19 Pandemic Case Study. So I'm sorry, but I'm just going to put on a little timer for myself because I just really don't want to go over. So that's a summary of the slides that are to come. I'm not going to go through this. I'm just going to dive straight in and get going. So what was the research about? So this research project was a literature study of the problem of disaster capitalism for humanitarian action and what lies beneath capitalism and neoliberalism. It used primarily academic literature as the data sources, as well as humanitarian industry reports and data. And sorry, guys, I'm just moving things around because I can't see all of my notes. There we go. So yeah, the case study as part of this research was looking at 5 different disaster capitalism cases, and the primary one was Pfizer's case. And part of the aim of this was to establish the extent of exploitation observed. So what I've done for today is drawn out the most relevant parts of this research for today's topic. And please bear with me, it will be a whistle-stop tour, and it is quite wordy, but I'm going to get through it as best I can. And to give you a definition of humanitarian action or humanitarianism, which I think is quite important up front, it's really to do with crisis response. So whether that's war, natural disaster or pandemic, humanitarian action or humanitarianism is concerned with alleviating human suffering in crisis situations. These were the original research questions, but I'm not going to read them all out. I will be sharing the slides afterwards, so if you want to go back and read them, then you can. So the first part of this research really looked at definitions. So what is capitalism? What is neoliberalism? So capitalism, the essential feature of capitalism is the motive to make a profit. And there's 7 key elements overall, according to the IMF. So there's profit, there's private property or ownership, competition, self-interest or individualism, market mechanisms, freedom and limited role of government. Now I've put freedom and limited role of government in green because these are really the parts of this presentation that are contested, or the parts of those 7 key elements that we're going to contest. Does capitalism really bring freedom? Is the government really limited in its role with regards to enabling capitalism? And another definition, yeah, maximization, profit, self-interest. And there's a great book called Rentier Capitalism by Guy Standing, and that really talks about capitalism in its modern form, which in his eyes is to do with the haves and the have-nots. The haves own everything, and those everythings are rented out to the have-nots. So neoliberalism. I'll do my best here. Obviously, there's a lot in here that we could talk about. So it embraces the idea of the self-regulating free market with its associated values of competition and self-interest as a model for effective and efficient government. And again, I've put that in green because it's contested. Is it really bringing about effective and efficient government? And the idea of the free market is really quite central to neoliberalism. It has to be free. And it has to be free because then it brings about an equilibrium or fairness or well-being to individuals. So free marketeers could be considered a synonym of neoliberal economists. And I picked out 3 elements of neoliberalism to sort of try and help explain what it is. So it's about the deregulation of the economy, the liberalization of trade and industry, and privatization of state-owned assets, amongst other things. And with regards to liberalization of trade and industry, it can encompass things like pro-business policy, subsidies, tax breaks, that sort of thing. So really neoliberalism is, you could say it's capitalism, but in the extreme. It's also a contested term. It can be seen in a positive light, but it also can be seen in a critical view. And this is really what this research contends, that we're seeing it in the critical sense of the term. So George Monbiot says that neoliberalism is the ideology at the root of all our problems. And he also says that what it does is it seeks to persuade us that our well-being is best realized not through political choice, but through economic choice. And that it's that economic choice and the free market that creates the fairness, etc. So, yeah, so as I mentioned, we're really seeing it as a critical term throughout the rest of this presentation. So 3 challenges of capitalism for humanitarian action. What are they? So the first challenge is non-values-based capitalism is juxtaposed to humanitarian action. And the reason is because humanitarian action is based on the principle of humanity to alleviate suffering, whereas capitalism's central goal is to pursue profit. So this research contends that nowhere in the definition of capitalism that I used is there a clearly foregrounded moral sentiment as a primary goal. Now, it's not to say that it can't be argued that there's a moral sentiment within capitalism, but in terms of the IMF definition, there wasn't a clearly foregrounded moral sentiment. And we know that the primary goal is to pursue profit. The fallacy of composition is also relevant here. And again, it's quite a big thing that I could probably talk to you a lot about. But in essence, not everybody can succeed with capitalism, is what we're talking about here. And the reason is because capitalism is competition-based. So this is despite the promise that capitalism is free and can sort of succeed for everyone, because capitalism is competition-based, which automatically means there's winners and losers. And there's the employee profit margin. So there's the profit margin between the business owner and the employee, which usually means that the business owner earns more than the employee, and the business earns more than the employee. Challenge 2 is about money, power, and structural issues. Now, this is another big thing. So I'm just going to skirt over this quite quickly. But basically, where the money flows, there is power. And it's something that we probably all know. So moving swiftly on to challenge 3. So this is really quite relevant to today's topic, inequality and poverty. So I'm just going to throw some stats at you. So income inequality. The top 10% of earners reap 53.5% of total income, whereas the poorest 50% of earners earn only 8% of total income, which I think is quite stark telling statistics. And wealth inequality is even worse. The top 10% of richest people own 77.7% of total global wealth. And the bottom or poorest 50% of people own 1.6% of total wealth. So Thomas Piketty says that, inequality reflects the impact of contemporary hypercapitalism or neoliberalism. And again, when we talk about wealth inequality, we're talking about ownership. What is it that people own? And the top 10% own nearly 80% of global wealth. So I think this chart as well is also very telling. So we have a bunch of lines at the top, a bunch of lines at the bottom. The ones at the bottom are how public wealth has been decreasing. And the ones at the top are how private wealth has been increasing in the past 40 years. So what does it say? Well, all of the money sits in private hands, and governments, certainly in the rich countries depicted here, now operate primarily at zero or in debt. So all the money sits in private hands, and we know that inequality means poverty for large parts of the population. Disaster capitalism. Okay, let's talk a bit about that, which is one of the key themes of this research. So a couple of definitions. I'm not going to read them both, but I'll read the first one. So every time a new crisis hits, even when the crisis itself is the direct byproduct of free market ideology, the fear and disorientation that follow are harnessed for radical social and economic re-engineering. So I've picked out two elements of disaster capitalism amongst others. Sometimes it's quite hard to say capitalism repeatedly. So we've got profiteering. So it's it's exploitation of crisis circumstances to make money. For example, non-tendered contracts or contracts offered in a sort of fast-tracked way, often to peers or friends of those issuing the contract. And then there's policy reform. Another aspect of disaster capitalism, and also it's a key part of neoliberalism. So policy reform is essentially about making changes for economic or business benefit, effectively. So neoliberalism, a big part of neoliberalism is policy reform. And essentially, policy reform that is pro-business can often be causal to making disasters worse, but it's also an outcome. It's also what happens as part of disaster capitalism, that the crisis is harnessed to enable policy reform to happen whilst everyone's in chaos, for the benefit of business and for the benefit of profit making. I think I'm doing quite well with time, quite proud of myself so far. So disaster capitalism during the pandemic. I think this sentence sums it up, or is quite telling for me. So corporations situated their business at the center of what counts as caring in order to make more money. We know that pre-existing inequality, I've sort of touched on this before, was a pandemic crisis multiplier. So it was causal to making the effects of the pandemic worse, but it was also an outcome. Inequality was heightened because of the pandemic. And of course, groups such as women, children, migrants, and BAME groups were the groups that were adversely affected. So moving on to the case study, which was part of this research. So there was 5 case studies, or 5 cases of pandemic disaster capitalism examined, but the primary one was Pfizer. So I'm really just going to talk to you about Pfizer and leave the other 4 for now, just purely because I haven't got much time. So this is the table that ended up being sort of the final result. And Pfizer, as you can see, I tried to this was about categorizing the businesses in some way, shape, or form. And so I tried to categorize them either in passive response, active exploitation, or causal responsibility. And ended up categorizing Pfizer's vaccine as active exploitation because they made 22 billion in profit in 2021, for example, and that was double profits over the year before. They withheld vaccine formulas, made these exorbitant profits, and didn't partake as much as they could have in global vaccine distribution. So the primary goal, as you can see, was to make profit. It wasn't to help people. Of course, a goal was to help people as well. That's why it's been categorized as benefits both the business and other people. Of course, the vaccine helps the masses. It did. But arguably, it could have helped people more if they didn't withhold vaccine formulas and they could have been shared across low-income countries, for example. So this is arguably disaster capitalism. And I know I've only got about a minute left, so I'm going to just rush a bit through these. So what happened with Pfizer? Well, they received subsidies to create the vaccine, but they also ended up receiving exorbitant profits. So it's effectively a double dividend at taxpayer expense. And the vaccine formulas shifted into private hands, not just with Pfizer, but with others as well. So they didn't become public goods. So the IP stayed with the vaccine companies and they were bestowed more wealth and power. So let's get to the key problem. So the key problem is, and I'm nearly done, Hannah, I know I'm nearly at my time. So the key problem here is really we're seeing profit over principle, and profit often wins. And Michelson says that really capitalism requires loss elsewhere. And that this problem of profit over principle, for example, is often unnoticed and is hidden in a complexity of circumstances. And basically has engendered surprisingly little scrutiny in economic ethics. We're at my final slide, so I hope you're still with me. So what can we do about that? Well, it's a big question. Putting some sort of principle or value ahead of profit making is the primary idea here. So could we put do no harm first? Obviously, it's not easy. We're talking a big, huge idea here. But even if it's not possible to implement such a thing, it still remains central to addressing the problem of capitalism, neoliberalism, and disaster capitalism. How do you do that? Well, we know that there's ways: circular, sustainable, corporate activities, etc. I've listed some other things that are relevant to challenges of the pandemic there. I'm not going to read them out because I've run out of time, but thank you very much. That was a whistle-stop tour. I hope you've taken some of it in. And back to you, Hannah.
Thanks so much, Joe. That was absolutely fascinating, and I'm glad you ended on some kind of optimistic note at the end there, because I was starting to feel a bit angry and sad. But thank you. Right, so now we're moving on to Dr. Neil Howard, who is a reader at the University of Bath, and I'm hoping is going to provide us some more space for optimism.
TBD, TBD. Revolution or barbarism really is what I'm left with at the end of
Fab.
Joe's talk, and I may be sharing something similar. All right, can you folks see this? Just to confirm, is the screen my PowerPoint visible?
Yes, yeah.
Cool. All right. Thanks very much for having me, peoples. Nice to be connected with the Institute for the first time, and I appreciate the invite. Not least because I'm a neighbour down the road in Bath. I'm, as Hannah says, a reader at the university here. Unambiguously the most ridiculous of all titles in academia, because kind of reading's sort of what we're supposed to do, but still. Of course, anyone who works in academia will recognize that that's not what you do after your PhD. You mainly teach, or if you're lucky, run around doing other such administrative things. But I do work on basic income. I do work on social protection. I am kind of by trade an anthropologist of development, if you will, and have spent many years being very critical of major international development and social policy institutions who task themselves with helping the poor and the vulnerable, and typically fail to do either of those things and often actually make life worse. All of which has led me to spend the last few years engaging in research around possible radical redistributive alternatives, in particular basic income, which is much of what I'll be talking about in the next 10 minutes or so. So just to sort of very rapidly recapitulate, I don't want to go over the sort of theoretical detail that Joe covered, but my remit today is to talk about capitalism, its links to poverty, their links to basic income, and how and whether basic income might offer us a pathway that is ameliorative in relation to poverty and potentially transformative or revolutionary in relation to capitalism. And so just core features of capitalism as a social system, as a totality, as many social theorists will put it. As we all know, private ownership of property, right? I own something, you own something. Very often people don't own anything, and certain people own very many things. The core motive of capital as a social system ultimately is accumulation, right? Joe rightly pointed out that the sort of moral sentiment of any individual capitalist may not necessarily translate into a governing moral sentiment of capitalism as an abstract system, but what does translate into a governing motive, a governing force, is the drive to accumulate. In other words, to make profit. Itself underpinned by the iron law of competition, right? One of the sort of pieces that we commonly, I have certainly, and many of my students tend to sort of forget in our, I think, very well-founded critiques of and discussed at the way that capital operates and structures our social lives, is that various capitals and capitalists are themselves necessarily also subject to the coercive force of competition, right? So the sort of intrinsic collaborative human pro-social skills that we have are either harnessed by capital's drive towards profit through competition, or they're run roughshod over. With regards to the role of the state, of course, I'm sure most of you are aware, and so I'm not going to dwell on all of this. I'm sure everybody has a decently worked out theory of capital who's here, but the narrative that the state's role in a capitalist system is kind of say get out of the way and just underwrite property relations and back up contracts and whatnot is obviously total crap. And clearly disproved by theory from enormous reams of writing over the centuries, and even more so by empirics looking at the way that the state doesn't have a merely sort of gently facilitative role, but historically has had a violently coercive role in establishing private property relations, in enclosing commons, in forcing people into labor regimes, and indeed continues to do so and has done so over recent neoliberal decades on these islands as much as elsewhere. Another sort of critical feature, and the reason I'm kind of foregrounding this is not to give an undergraduate 101 lesson in capitalism, but really to kind of lead into along a pathway through this talk from capital's core features through to its consequences around poverty and vulnerability, and then directly into basic income as a sort of plausible, hypothesized solution/response. And so one of the kind of critical elements of capital as we understand it is the fact that social reproduction is typically unremunerated, right? Women's work not. Marx himself is sort of guilty of not really fully conceptualizing the fact that the world of workers doesn't just come into being ready for capital to exploit. Those workers are fed, they are nourished, they are loved, and that work is unremunerated. Capital ultimately benefits the capitalist system, and at the top of that, those who are rich and wealthy and doing very well in their project of accumulation tend to be able to benefit from the fact that the core work of social reproduction, keeping us alive, is unremunerated and typically gendered. A final piece, again, as Joe mentioned, capitalism has a historic tendency towards inequality. Thomas Piketty's work has obviously been pretty pivotal in recent years in re-emphasizing that and sort of putting it back onto the top of political agendas, though it was never terribly far away from many critical consciousnesses. But alongside the fact that capital has a tendency to produce inequality is the fact that, as we know, capital will harness inequality, right? Capitalism as a system has, worked through constructions of race. It's worked through constructions of gender, as of course it has done through colonial domination, as well as class conflict, right? So inequality is sort of baked into the DNA of capital as we know it, and the consequences that derive therefrom. At the heart of which, historically and today, basically are poverty and vulnerability, right? We are seeing secular trends around inequality, the sort of core Marxian insight around the injustice and the unpalatability and the negative internalities, really, rather than externalities of capitalism as a system, is this double freedom, as Marx put it, right? You are free to say yes or no to a job as this sort of liberal atom in contract-based society, but the sort of subtext of saying yes or no to any given job is, of course, saying yes or no to survival unless you are able to autonomously secure the means of your existence, which most of us can't. Historically, the poor have not been able to, and even in the present moment, the majority of people cannot, right? So at the kind of ontological core of capitalism as a system, the subtext of the freedom that the IMF optimistically identified as one of capitalism's core characteristics is also the freedom to go hungry and in the end starve if you are not able to provide for yourself outside of the wage relationship. All of which, of course, speaks directly to the fact that insecurity, economic insecurity, material insecurity is itself a defining feature of life under capitalism, right? I think anybody who has been poor, anybody who has at any point not been sure about their work or where their next paycheck was going to come from or whether they are going to be able to pay their bills, which is very plausibly many folks here, has certainly at different points been me, and is quantitatively the majority of humanity, and certainly on these islands, will be able to tell you, even if not in sophisticated theoretical terms, that insecurity is like written into the DNA of capitalism as a social system. And we know, as Remco will go on to discuss, I think at much greater length and with much greater sophistication in a moment, that the consequences of insecurity are profound for people's well-being, right? They are fundamental in regards to people's physical health. There's important work, again, that Remco is going to be talking about around the social determinants of health, which leads on to and into an argument for basic income, but is now decades dated and in many respects sort of underpins the construction of welfare state 1.0 in these islands. Physical health, mental health, spiritual health, even, emotions like hope and people's felt sense of dignity, all of these are commonly attacked by the insecurity that is inherent to capitalism. As indeed is the experience of power inequality and domination, for instance, at the workplace. Again, putatively free though the worker may be to leave one job in favor of another, however fictitious that freedom might be in practice, even if you're on the job, unless you're lucky, your boss is potentially going to be dominating you one way or another. The simple fact of having to accept a job in order to survive puts you in a position that sort of liberal, libertarian, and certainly Republican theorists will refer to as domination. In the end, someone is in charge. Your autonomy is constrained. The autonomy of the capitalist, by virtue of having money as power, is differentially less constrained than yours. So this freedom that we have, and that is sort of fundamentally touted as one of the beauties of capitalism, for example, in comparison to communism or socialism, as these have been tried, is frankly a load of old baloney. Taking us sort of up, if you like, away from the micro experience of domination at work, which is not to say that everybody's experience of work is dominating, but we do know that very large portions of society do experience work as domination. Up to the sort of macro meta level, it's also now well established that the relationship between capital and the state is symbiotic. Historically, this has been the case. You know, the expansion of capitalism globally rode on the coattails of and at times steered the expansion of European powers through colonization and plunder, right? So there was a historical imbrication between state and militarily backed expansion, exploitation, expropriation, and capital and capitalism developing as a system. And likewise, we see now extremely clearly, of course, in the case of Trump over in the US, but of course also within our political parties, not least the Conservatives and now Reformers that are rising, there's a profound interrelationship between money and political power. And very interestingly, as I'm sure many of you are aware, Oxfam produced a study 2 or 3 years ago looking at the relationship between inequality and concentrations of money power and basically de-democratization and the way that ultimately the rich capture the state. Finally, of course, you know, one of the critical consequences of and expressions of money as power is the use of inequality, not just as a mechanism for capital to accumulate, for people who are already rich to get more rich, but ultimately for society to remain in a position of sort of structural domination, for the vast majority of us to remain in positions of structural domination through the logic of divide and rule. You pit an immigrant community from X against a recently arrived immigrant community from Y, or a native community from Z, and you are more likely to be able to ensure class-based domination than you would if you addressed structural inequalities head on. All of which brings us to basic income, right? The long and the short of everything I've just said for the last 7 or 8 minutes is basically capitalism's pretty shit, and it has loads of negative side effects, and indeed written into its very ontological essence, written into its structure, are anti-life forces, if you will. And there are now a huge number of scholars and activists and increasingly political parties and political authorities who are turning towards basic income as a potential strategy for softening capitalism's worst edges, and maybe even taking us beyond capitalism's worst edges, or rather capitalism as a system. What is basic income? Basic income, I understand basic income, or I tend to sort of try to explain basic income as basically like a pension, but for everybody, right? So a basic income is defined by the Basic Income Earth Network as a regular, unconditional, universal cash transfer. I believe those are 4 of the 5. I may be missing one of the definitional elements, but the critical point is if you need money to survive in capitalist society, which you do, then as a right, every individual should have a regular supply of it, sufficient to guarantee a sort of minimum degree of economic security, to guarantee survival. And so a basic income, like a pension, would operate on an individual basis in cash, but critically without means test or work requirement. So unlike many contributory pensions, and unlike pretty much all other social security mechanisms, which are conditional either in the sense that they target certain groups of individuals or that they require certain forms of behavior, a basic income is just a grant given to everybody in perpetuity to support survival, right? And so the theorists here in the bottom left of your screen, this lovely smiley, at this point, relatively aged gentleman, a friend and inspiration to me and many others, no doubt, Philippe Van Parijs, sort of one of the key theorists and advocates here, will argue that one of the core possibilities inherent in a basic income is its ability to provide a degree of security, right? To offset the inherent experience of insecurity when you live under capitalism. Likewise, people suggest that a basic income could increase worker power, right? If we go back to a couple of slides ago, what I was saying about Marx and this idea of a double freedom, you're free to say no to a job, but you're kind of free to starve if you do so. The sort of one of the core theoretical claims amongst supporters of a basic income is that freedom really needs to be understood more as the ability to say no rather than to say yes, for example, to a given work relationship. But for that, you need to be able to sustain yourself if you say no. So a basic income is kind of theorized as this potential tool to increase worker power individually and potentially also collectively by, for example, operating something akin to a strike fund such that workers en masse could say no to shitty working conditions. Obviously, in relation to that, of course, we can also speak about health and well-being, right? And once again, I mentioned a moment ago, the social determinants of health, probably intuitive to all of us, super well established in the science. Being poor is really not great for your health and is obviously causally correlated with a universe of ill beings, non-communicable diseases, and so on and so forth. Ergo, the sort of counterfactual logic goes, if people are provided with a basic income that addresses their sort of core material security, then quite likely, and indeed the counterfactual evidence is very strong that it will, people's health in a variety of domains and their well-being, their stress, for example, will improve. And the final piece that it often comes up, I mean, there are many more theoretical claims made in favor of basic income, but one of those that speak to what I'm saying now and to me are most kind of emotionally significant is around dignity, right? If working in capitalism, living under capitalism involves inequality, involves domination, and involves insecurity, by virtue of those three, it necessarily also involves indignity and shame. And Amartya Sen, the Nobel Prize-winning economist, has famously argued that shame is at the irreducible core of poverty, which Robert Walker, Oxford, has researched in great depth all over the world and proved, broadly speaking, to be a universal experience. Well, given that, basic income advocates typically say, you know what? Let us turn this on its head, provide people with economic security through a basic cash transfer that is universal and non-withdrawable, in other words, a basic income, and we are likely to see an increase in the opposite of shame, in other words, dignity.
Neil, would you mind starting to wrap things up? Sorry.
Yeah, sure.
Thank you.
Sorry, I'll stop in a moment. So the final piece I'll say, there's loads of empirics on this, and in another talk, and had I not banged on at such great length, I would have been delighted to have spoken to you about the research that we've done empirically in South Asia. I've been involved in running a couple of basic income pilots, and indeed there's research taking place all over the world. You'll see the dots on this map here in the United States. Each one of these reflects a micropilot, a basic income micropilot that is taking place in the US. And above that, the words, the logo Give Directly, the logo of one of the world's now most rapidly growing charities, NGOs, which is also experimenting with just giving people direct cash, all of which is feeding into political developments in places like Brazil, in places like South Africa. The evidence is pretty clear that all of that which is hypothesized to be ameliorative about basic income's impact on the negative externalities of life under capitalism is kind of borne out. The final piece, though, and we don't know much about this empirically, but there's kind of hope, is the idea that basic income could also be used against capitalism. So not just as a policy tool that helps make life less shit under a system that is quite shitty, but that it might open doors for rebalancing the way that we organize our society more in favor of the many and against the few. For example, through the progressive taxation that would be required, right? If we're going to fund a basic income, it necessarily means taking from the rich to give to the rest of us. Folks theorize that by virtue of everybody receiving the universality of basic income as a policy, there's a possibility of moving us away from the sort of divide and rule politics that characterize contemporary society towards a more sort of broad-based unity in favor of collective change. And that itself feeds into the claim that, as Carol Pateman has famously argued, that a lot of the political efforts of the left fail because basically in the context of structural inequality and not having much time, it requires heroic efforts to do anything. But if your material security is taken care of, quite plausibly, there's an avenue for greater collective organization and political mobilization towards redistribution and justice. The research on this is limited, but the case is plausible. I'll stop there. There's loads more to say, but thank you very much for listening to me.
Thanks very much. That was absolutely fascinating, and I'm sure there's going to be lots of discussion about universal basic income in the sessions that follow. So thank you. Right, and now we're going to pass over, last not least, to Dr. Branko Peters, who is a colleague here at the University of Bristol in the School of Policy Studies, who is going to talk, as you alluded to, Neil, a bit more about the kind of health dynamics of this. So over to you, Branko.
Thank you, Anna. Just quickly share my screen. So everybody can see the slides. That's the case. Yes, thank you, everybody. I hope you still have a bit of energy to listen to my presentation. And it's an unforgiving task to follow up these brilliant presentations by Joe and Neil. But I think Neil already gave a really nice background. I'm going to present, or really solid foundation. So I'm going to delve a bit deeper into the health case for universal basic income in a capitalist context. And here I'll mainly draw from evidence of unconditional cash transfer programs in North America and Europe, but I'll also highlight a study by Give Directly that Neil briefly mentioned in Kenya that sort of more meets multiple of the features of a universal basic income. So I don't think I have to, after these presentations, I don't have to tell you much about the destructive force of capitalism on widening inequalities, and also in context of austerity politics that have more pervasively degraded these social terms of health. That comes at the cost of health inequity and widening health inequalities. And I've included here a couple of stats, but just to summarize, basically, what is very much clear is that within the capitalist context, within neoliberal politics, this is widening health inequalities over time, also in the case of England, but also more globally. Mortality and life expectancy here and other health outcomes differ really strongly across income groups and areas of deprivation. So where you're being born, where you grew up, really matters for your health. And this goes in parallel with the degradation of many public services, austerity politics, including the means-tested work to welfare, social welfare programs, including the Universal Credit in the UK, that has trapped people in poverty and precarity traps. And there's an increasing number of studies that have actually documented the really negative health, in particular mental health impacts among eligible populations of these programs, whereas also, and I think you already alluded to, dignity and stigma are very important here. Recent reports have shown that millions of people are eligible to receive a bit of support, are not addressing this or not applying for this for various reasons, but stigma has a huge role to play. So I think I already don't have to make the case for basic income, but yes, basic income could potentially eradicate poverty overnight, but also importantly cover the most vulnerable groups in a more dignified manner. But importantly, it can also provide people across the socioeconomic gradient to choose the life that they wish to lead. Moreover, providing economic stability can also strengthen the effectiveness of other interventions that address social determinants of health, such as education, among others. So to the evidence, I'm taking a more comprehensive approach here for health. Again, mainly, as of this moment, no full-fledged universal basic income program has been implemented everywhere that meets all those features of the basic income Earth network definition. But we can already get some more insight on the basis of unconditional cash transfer programs. So this the interest in the health impacts of cash transfer on conditional cash transfer programs and UBI, and specifically has drawn much interest and has led to the publication of multiple systematic reviews where they found that they found benefits on physical health outcomes, such as increased birth weight, decreased likelihood of birth weight, decreased probability of young people having obesity, and also lower body mass indexes. Again, this is based on unconditional cash transfer programs. Many of these are still targeted and means tested, but they can already give us some insight. Also, evaluations have shown multiple mental and social well-being benefits of receiving more income stability over a longer period of time, such as a reduced stress, psychiatric disorders, including depression, social stigma, but also sense of dignity, self-confidence, social engagement, and relationships among family members, but also within communities. And generally, as Neil has alluded to, also in terms of spiritual health, generally more hopeful outlook in life, general satisfaction in life, but also reported improved confidence to influence societal matters, which can actually be quite an important topic when you start discussing about UBI against capitalism. There's also been lots of health promoting behavior reported, such as improved food security and more diverse diets, a very important determinant of overall physical, mental, and social health, but also on a wider range of different social determinants of health, including education, healthcare, and housing security. And again, here I repeat that this is mainly on negative income tax programs, which are unconditional, but still means tested, targeted, and perhaps not at the size of the transfer that you to meet basic needs, but already the results are quite striking. There's also an ongoing review, comprehensive qualitative review by myself and colleagues, where we delve deeper into the qualitative evaluation of unconditional cash transfer programs globally. I will not go through this figure too much in detail, but what we mainly reason is that cash transfer can be seen as a health intervention that allows people with the agency to invest in health-related resources, including diverse diets, clothing, but also education and other social determinants of health. This has multiple health functions, promotive, curative, and preventive, which then affect multiple outcomes of health, including overall health, physical, mental, social, and spiritual. So the ongoing analysis really confirms much of the quantitative evaluations that I've presented in the previous slides, where people provide a bit more reasoning, but really indicated that if you give people income stability, they know best and what kind of health related resources, assets, etc., to invest in order to promote their own health. And what I really like to highlight here, and I think that's what Neil already mentioned in this presentation, is especially the time and the agency that income stability gives people in order to, if, for example, improve their social relationships, engage with more leisure, but also to focus more on themselves. Also mentioned that I would highlight one key One Give Directly study that's currently implemented in Kenya, which is which ticks most of the boxes. We can argue whether it's truly universal because it's not necessarily implemented on a national level, but it is being distributed both long-term cash transfers for 12 years, short-term, and a one lump sum cash transfer to everybody within this context. And some recent quantitative evaluations have already found promising results on physical, mental, and health-related behaviors. And interestingly, they also found drinking to the respondents found drinking to perceive less of an issue within their communities, And I'm highlighting this here because often a critique of a UBI by UBI opponents is that people would engage with more unhealthy behaviors such as drugs, alcohol drinking, etc. But thus far, there hasn't been really any evidence that that states this, and these results emphasize that. So I think that statement can be moved slowly to the myth section. I hope you can see the image. It's a bit blurred on my slide, but based on the evidence thus far on unconditional cash transfer programs, Matthew Johnson and colleagues, including Neil, have developed and updated a very helpful basic income impact model on health, where they basically propose 3 key pathways through which poverty reduction, income inequality, and income instability within our current system can ultimately improve individual and community health well-being. For instance, through improvement of satisfaction material needs, individual and pro-social behavior change, but very importantly, also stress reduction, as people can invest in things that improves their own mental, social, spiritual well-being. And also a more recent study, considering that a true UBI has not been implemented, there is still a lot of theorization, but Neil actually, and he can correct me or add to anything that I'm missing here, but they recently conducted a study where they were investigating more about belief among London citizens into more deprived neighborhoods, and they felt that their UBI could improve their physical, mental, and social well-being, reduce stress, and very importantly, limit the currently experienced indignities of the current welfare system, in this case, universal credit. So the health case for UBI, even if there are no evaluations of long-term, fully universal basic income experiments are currently available, the health case is quite strong. However, there's also been some critique. For instance, one of the most frequently mentioned ones is an actually adequate UBI could potentially be unaffordable. However, taking the health case that could actually counter this argument as some recent simulation modeling by Johnson and colleagues actually showed that it could actually save costs for healthcare services, and through multiple different health benefits, including quality adjusted life years, could actually save us a lot in the long run. So the universal-based income as an upstream intervention, also addressing all the social determinants of health, could actually pay itself back. There are also some concerns from a health equity perspective. So for instance, if we were to implement a universal basic income in our current system, it could actually lead to dismantling of other aspects of the welfare state infrastructure, transforming welfare into solely unconditional cash transfers or into UBI would not necessarily change the dynamics that we're already currently facing in our capitalist society. So we could still have the strong relationship between private providers and consumers, and less the focus on collective responsibility. Moreover, private providers and other sectors, such as the food industry, could actually increase their prices, as a result, which could devalue the impact of a basic income. Many UBI advocates will also will agree and will state that the UBI is definitely not a panacea, especially not within our current system. This needs to be accompanied with other income, wealth redistribution policies, some of these that Neil already alluded to. And UBI would also have to be complemented with other universal services to promote health equity, such as, for instance, vulnerable groups with a disability. The services need to be intact. So there needs to be careful consideration of the potential consequences of implementing UBI on health equity in this in our in our design and development of a UBI. I think I'll stop here. I think I'm already over time. Thank everybody for listening, and I'm really looking forward to the discussions afterwards.